Hello. Today I want to show you our first making of video of our help series videos for Tile Pro, the Tile Pro engine. This video here will be to show you how you make a simple brick wall with Tile Pro. In that case we will use the Corona engine. Tile Pro works with any of the available engines on Cinema 4D that supports shaders, Cinema 4D shaders. We tested it with V-Ray, with Corona, with Redshift, with Octane. It probably works also with Arnold and so on. We will show you all the engines with videos and making offs of different materials. Today we make a brick material with the Corona engine. I just choose Corona here, more is not to set. This is the very new version 5, which has the great new 2.5D displacement. It's a kind of like the V-Ray 2D displacement, very fast, RAM efficient and so on. So you can really use it everywhere. Can use it a lot now in Corona. It's a super great feature of that new version. I have just the plane and the camera. So you see nothing here because it's really just a simple plane. I made a Corona material, just a normal one here. And let's add this to the polygon. I have just a simple UV for the whole stuff here. You can use any mapping. Important is maybe that you use really a big mapping. So best to cover the whole thing. If I zoom out here, you cover everything with one texture. And how often it repeats and so on, we set an inside Tile Pro. I will open the node editor. Tile Pro works nice in the node editors. Here I have the Corona node editor. We have 3 times Tile Pro here. They're basically copies of the first setup here for the colors. We will have this for some bump and reflection mapping, and we have one special one, a simplified one for the displacement, which has the different coloring, grayscale coloring for the displacement to get a 3D structure. I will show you how this Tile Pro setup works now with the color setting here that I made. We made, maybe I go here in the normal setup that you also see that. That's the wrong, that was, so here's the Corona one. I would add such a Tile Pro just like a shader. Here's the Tile Pro engine. If I choose that, I get this here, or black, if it's not filled yet. And if I click on it, I see this here, or like this. And if you click on that surface here, which is the Tile Pro preview itself, then you click on it to get the Tile Pro tile editor. The Tile Pro editor now is something where you can draw polygons, 2D surface polygons, and can edit them. You can copy them, variations, give variations to it. Basically, it's like, you can edit points, move points, add points, smooth points, draw boxes or any freeform shapes. There's no limit of that. And the very nice one is that this is an endless canvas. So if you move something out here, it comes back here on this side, or you move something up, it comes up here. So also half of the shapes. So it's an endless canvas, which makes great stuff possible. So any geometry you put in here is like an endless canvas. The next what we can do here is to assign colors. These colors are very often helpful for Tile Pro to give extra variation. Of course you can just use textures, but often it's good to mix the textures with some random color you put here again. So with assign color, I could just use a color here and assign that manually. Or probably better, we can set a gradient here and just randomize everything on one click. You have different seeds here, so if you choose a different seed, you have different randomness. If you want to keep it uniform, the same random seed over the different channels, it's good to use the same seed number here. yeah, basically it's that simple. I just put in the colors or color ranges I want, and all the colors from this range get assigned here via one button. The next is I can texture IDs. I can assign texture IDs, and of course I can again set a texture ID and place them then. I make it here texture ID is visible. Or as you see, there's many shapes. You can do it again at one click. For this example, I prepared 5 shaders or textures. So I set that to 0 to 4, to channel ID in 0 to 4, which is 5 textures. Click randomize and you have set them all. Again, this works with a seed for precise control. Basically, that's it. I assign the color, I assign the texture ID. Before I have drawn these shapes, you can also load predefined shapes from a library. We have 150 libraries from 3 libraries shipping with them. And oops, I closed it by accident. Or you can save your drawn shapes to the library and reuse later on. I close this now. I make the preview a little larger. And I show you now how we can set in detail these previews. It's basically always the same for any setup. So it's like a cook recipe. Once you have understand how this works, I think it's very simple to use and very effective. The first thing is here, the preview, the size. You've seen that already. And for some engines, it's good to set extra this LVF, light linear workflow correction. For some engines like Corona, it will have Cinema adds a wrong gamma. So if you press that, the Tile Pro engine checks that for you and corrects the gamma. So the output will be right. Cinema automatic linear workflow not messes in. The next is here, you can set, as you can have more than one layer, you can set solo or not. If you have several layers and they're blending inside, it's if solo is off, it shows here the result of all layers below here. But for setting up a layer, very often it's useful to start with solo mode, so you really just see this layer. For a simple brick, we of course have just one layer, that's enough. Then you have a blending mode for the layer and so on, but as said, we don't need that for here. And then the shader parameters are basically 3 things to set up, not more. That's the textures, that's the tile editor, parameters and variations in itself. And then it's how the edges are handled and the space in between. We start with the textures, and the textures have the first main control here. The main button first, I explain you here what these features are, is the UV from tile. As each tile here actually has its own mapping control. There are 2 ways how they are mapped. It can be each tile from the full surface, or really each tile like a full separate element. For that case, we have each has its own mapping, but in relation to the full space. We have that off. I would click it on, it would look slightly different. In that case, it makes not so much difference, but other cases, we will show you it's useful to have that on, like for wood floors or something. In that case, I turn it off. The next is the texture opacity. We have set textures, and I can here globally control how much they mix on these colors we set here before. Yeah. In that case, we have like 0.5 mixing. If I set it to 0, yeah, you see that maybe we put on also the interactive rendering to see that better. So we have it here. And if I set that textures to 0, you see what happens. We just have the simple colors, and if I set that to full, we have a lot of coloring. For my setup here, I want it to be around 0.5 mixing in somehow. Yeah. Okay. The next is the global scale of the textures. You see how in U and V separated, you can stretch here the textures, or you can scale it in both sides. I put it to 1 again here. You see it very interactively works with IPRs. You can have random rotations for the textures. You can random offsets for the textures to give further randomization. So it really nothing repeats anymore here. For these simple bricks, we don't need that. Then a special shuffle randomness of the textures. If you put here none as we have it default, it just really the texture IDs, which we see soon in the shaders, really will be assigned as we have it here. So texture 1 or texture 0 will be assigned to ID 0, texture 1 to ID 1, and so on. If we would put in here random, it gives a further randomness, even if repeating parts of this texture. If you have another UV tile or another one, it will be really random above the repetition of the shader. For this, we don't need it yet, but I just explain you how this works. There maybe also cyclic or up, down, or you control by another shader how to how the placement will be used. There's endless possibilities how to control that, and a random rotation of the stuff can also often help a lot to randomize the input. And of course we can set the shaders themselves. So here I have 5 textures. They are Cinema 4D layer shaders. Basically just a noise. I love the blistered noise, for example, for some basic randomness, and then I put on some great grunge texture and mix them with overlay mode. The same stuff here we have made for all the other textures, different variations, colors, saturations, and so on. Each texture slot can have its own multiplier. That means how much it mixes on the base Tile Pro colors. It has its own size in UNV, own rotation, so you can deeply control that. We have, you see, different multipliers, different size settings, and so on. Temporarily, you can turn on off textures here. Via the browse folder, you can just browse to a folder and load like many textures at once at one click. It's good again for like wood floors or stuff where you have a lot of textures to load. Basically, there's no limit in textures, just your RAM amount. Important also, a used texture, if it's placed here several times, uses only one time the RAM, of course. Yeah, that's like one small texture, even if used 100 or 1,000 times. So we have set the size, the mixing, the randomness of the texture, and which textures. You see here also the text null is for the ID null, text 1 is for ID 1, text 2 is for ID 2, and so on. That was the first part, the textures. The second part is the Tile Pro parameters itself. We have the repetition in U and V, and that's maybe something important to know. It's, as said, it's always good that you have the texture itself covering as big as possible. So here we have the texture covering the whole surface, and if you wanted to have that smaller after repeating, I would not set here 2 or something. Normally, I mean, you can do that, but then the repetitions will be identical, the same, which Random Pro can do better. So normally we just not set here the repetition, but inside the shader. So we can set here also repetitions. You see the stuff, the tile shape itself gets repeated in U and V 2 times. And the great stuff here, it never repeats, so all the random stuff we set is going over the tiles, over the repetitions. And that's very important for having really complex, good, non-repeating surfaces. For here now, for this test, we keep it at 1, that we see more detail. I show you the random point scale. As said, these are really polygons with points, and you can randomize the position of the points. Yeah? The more points you have, actually, the more complex the randomness is. If it's just a box like here, most of the time, it's just giving variation to the edge points. We have a global variation in rotation. Then you have a back color. That's something we not use here, but normally you have can define the color here if you have no mortar or something, and how transparent that should be, and then a texture for that. of its own multiplier. The tile variations have now something that is very powerful to give further variation to the tile. The intensity multiplier is something, if I make it stronger, you see what it does. I can set how intense the variation is and how many percentage of the shapes will be affected. So for example, I can make this very strong, but just a very few tiles affected. Or normally much more natural, I make it a slight variation, but affecting many tiles. The same I have with color variation. I can set to be everything colored by random, or just a few tiles and maybe not so intense, then it's more natural. And this is further to the tile variation, color variation we did already in the tile editor. It's more, you can overlay and mix both. That gives the most natural variation structures. And the important is if you have something repeating here, those stuff even gives a variation over the repeating elements, so they actually never repeat. The same is random rotations. For bricks makes not so much sense, but for others, random offsets would make sense here if you use subtle, but I leave it now for here. For this simple example, we don't need it. And if I've set that here, we have basically set the tile editor parameters. So first the textures and load the textures, second the tile parameters itself with its randomness, and third we go to the shapes, actually to the shape borders and how they are handled and how the space between the borders are handled. We have the bevel, which is a rounding or fading off from the tile shape to the outside, to the corner. We can set that very strong. I have it just subtle here, and in that case we set it to fade to the outer appearance. And I can deactivate the fading, then it goes to the color, back color we set here in the textures. In that case it's black. There's a rounding edge feature which I can turn off, then we have a fading to the borders but without really rounding the geometry. We can have an automatic randomization on our whole stuff here, set how strong or not strong this is, how intense this value is. We have a curve to set that, how exactly the fall off will be. I turn for here on again the fading and make it very subtle, and it breaks up the sharpness a little bit. The next is the mortar, which is the space in between the shapes. Can has a texture. We have here just 3 layers of Cinema 4D noise, which is really great, and multiplier for the noise over the color. Full mortar is normally useful because we really want to fill everything. If you turn that off and set a size, it's just an area around the shape. Erosion, that's a very useful parameter. It's like a displacement, a 2D edge displacement to each shape. So I put again a Cinema 4D noise here. I have the multiplier and I have the scale, how big the effect is, the displacement effect. I set it very strong here to show you that's too strong. That's like 2. So here you see when you set it very strong, it gives totally worn out displacement-like effect, or actually it's a displacement on these shapes, 2-dimensional. And I can set the scale. I think it's quite explaining here what it does. Again, we usually set it subtle to have it really nicely breaking up the stuff. It would be impossible to set all these irregularities really to draw that into the polygons in the editor. You can make it parametric here and see you have a nice irregulation on these bricks here controlled by shader. And again, we have a curve which can in detail control how this displacement works in relation to the edge. The next is the outline. The outline is now like the bevel going to the outside, something going to the inside, fading to the inside. It's like a V-Ray dirt. Who knows V-Ray? Or other engines have dirt-like effects for the edges. So it takes the edges here, and you can set a color, set a size, set a texture with its own multiplier, of course, which gives some worn edges, some dirt edges. And if you look here, you see this white dirt stuff coming from the edges, from the mortar or something, and it's broken up with the opacity texture here, which is a noise again, and you have endless possibilities here. Yeah, it's again, who knows V-Ray dirt? It's exactly that, but easier to use and directly on the shapes, and you have control over the texture and the opacity and the fall off of the opacity. Very easy to use and very effective to break up the texture even more. And most things have some reaction to the edge of the shape, to the edge of the tiles, and you have the full control in here. So that was the bevel, the mortar, the erosion, the outline. The mosaic is something, you know what a mosaic is. You could drive the color even more by a texture here overall. For brick, of course, we don't know that. That makes another video then. Basically, that's the setup. I will go now again maybe in the node editor. I love the Corona node editor. And what we had here is a copy of the Tile Pro. We just filled a little different textures to break up the randomness, some stripes. Here, in fact, we have, I think, a Tile Pro shader inside the Tile Pro, so you can endless stack them, give some irregular structures with noise, with grunge maps, and so on. The rest of the setup is the same, so we copied it and just filled new textures. This is we will use for the bump map. So we put it here into the bump and set the bump strengths, and this gives already, you know, a nicer look here. If you look here on the IPR, we see something is happening. Yeah, breaks up already, gives structure. And we have another copy, a little bit simplified in the texture, just less random textures inside, more subtle. And the mortar we made a lot darker to give in the displacement a more depth. It goes more inside the surface. And this texture we will link to the displacement. You see here it gives a nice displacement effect immediately. Yeah, 10 centimeters seems a good value. I close that. And normally I have it's good to restart the IPR displacement use, because it really changes the geometry extremely. So it calculates the GI, and here's the material with displacement and everything. And you see how fast and easy you can make a very complex brick material, which is actually a very simple brick material. All the randomness, actually we used, I think, only a few grunge map textures. That was all. Yeah, all that stuff, all that detail comes from Tile Pro and using a little Cinema 4D noises. That's it. Of course, you can play now. We could add some stuff in the reflection maps or something. For example, I could put that in the texture and that in the glossiness. And if you go to the material reflection map, yeah, that's okay. We mix in a little slight reflection for a bit glossiness. Probably I will put a filter shader here to reduce the glossiness a bit. Yeah. Okay. So that should give the effect I want. Sadly, the glossiness in Corona has no mix value, something I really wished it would have, like V-Ray has. Because normally you just want to mix in a glossy texture, just a few percentage, not fully, and then set the rest via the value. But you can do it via the filter shader. It's more or less the same. And use that here. So you can use the Tile Pro. You can use with one Tile Pro many shader channels at once, or have copies of that are fine-tuned to give more perfect effect on the result. And you get very, very easy here real-time effects from the shader. Okay, this is, I just make a last rendering of that with the reflections. When you use heavy displacement in the Corona eye pair, I sometimes need to restart it. You nicely see how a great never repeating texture. You can zoom out now of this, it would be never repeating if you set it up like I explained before. Reflection was a bit too much, so probably I want to make it less and make it darker. Okay, and render it again. You see how fast it renders, even with this displacement detail. I probably should still, I have a little bit too much reflection here, but I leave it for now. Of course, we could map it on a huge surface too. We could use the repeat features inside the shaders to have different sizes and cover huge areas. It will never repeat if we set it up as I explained before. As next, we will also show you videos for wood floors, concrete tiles, for structureless, never repeating surfaces like asphalt or plaster and stuff like that. I hope you liked the video. As said, it's just the first one of a series, and tell us what we shall show you, where you need explanations. Take your time to get into it. It's very easy once you know how it works. Basically, I said it's like a cook recipe. It always repeats the same 3 steps. We always go through setting up the tiles, setting up the textures, setting up the editor parameters with its variation, and the special things like the edge, how the edges work, and the mortar in between. Okay, that's it for today. The next videos will cover also Corona, V-Ray and Redshift and Octane. So we show you the plugin in each engine and in different uses. Thanks for today, and goodbye.